why does this all matter? Why do we actually need to consider the economic sphere, or like an economic policy dimension within a feminist foreign policy? As we all know, this has been talked in the Women, Peace and Security agenda a lot. This has been a very prominent theme within foreign policy the last 20 years maybe, or even further. But why does the economic sphere matter as well? Caren, can I give you the word first?
I'm going to answer this by going back in the past to talk about the reasons I became an economist. I actually wanted to study political science and go into law. And I had the great pleasure actually of working in 1980 on the UN on the conference to mark the midpoint of the decade on the UN Decade for Women, which was pretty amazing. And I was quite young then, and I think my eyes were really, really open to the way that the economy drives almost everything in the world. Financial flows, investment flows, monetary policy, even though many people don't understand it, fiscal policy, the way corporations behave. And I think very much at a micro level, the ways in which people can access and have control over economic resources is just so critical for basic economic security, for safety, for resilience to shocks, for investment in productive potential, and I think as back then, as a very young learner of feminist economics, which was really in its infancy, seeing the importance of using policy tools to change very unequal economic power relations and trends, whether it was the control of the quote unquote the advanced economies over economies that are considered developing economies, whether it is really focusing on how you use tools like taxation or fiscal policy to reduce egregious inequalities within countries and not just between countries. So I also think that the economic sphere is so important in terms of potentially, not always, reducing conflict and human security. When you think about conflicts over different types of economic resources, whether it's minerals or water resources and so forth. So it has that possibility. And I think fundamentally, the economic sphere is just so fundamental to well-being. It doesn't mean that other things are not important, but if you don't have the economy right, you don't have the ability to invest in the kind of public services that are really critical for human capabilities and for provisioning. You don't have the resources to invest in education and health and social protection and care and other things. So we really need to get the economy right to be able to have all of the fundamentals of a good society.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm so glad you became a feminist economist, because I cited so many of your work in my master's thesis. So glad you went down that path. Vanessa, would you like to add anything to that question?
Just, briefly to give you, first of all, I haven't had an opportunity to say congratulations, this is fantastic and really, really well done. Secondly, it's fantastic also to be with so many great colleagues like Caren, and I see Carmen and others on the call, and my mom, of course. So, I'm a civil engineer. I did civil engineering rather as my degree. I came from banking and finance into development. So I take very much a pragmatic and rational approach to these things. And, I would say it's really important because to a large extent, the way power is distributed, the way our quality of life pans out, the way influence is distributed, amongst many other things that we really need to fulfill and maximize the most of our lives, is based on perceived contributions. It's based on perceived economic output. And yet so much of women's work isn't counted, and so much of women's work isn't valued. Unpaid care work being one of the areas that the report touches on, or household work and so on isn't even counted in measurement of economic production. And then, the value of women's work as well. We see that when sectors become feminized or defeminized, the value accruing, the wages paid or value accruing in those sectors changes. If you look at coding, which used to be a very female sector, became more valuable as it became defeminized. So I think the way the economy interacts with society and gender constructs is different for different people, and this is why I think it's really important that this is taken into account, both in the economic sphere and vice versa.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I hear a lot about it's just foundational, especially if we depart from a human security kind of notion of security, right? Because poverty and then stability and conflict, it all links together. Power relations, making women seen and their value, the work valued, it's just essential that we have an economic dimension, a fiscal policy dimension with a feminist foreign policy framework, right? So now to the second question, when you think of your own work or area of work, what would change or be more straightforward or maybe more easy if more states were to adopt a feminist foreign policy covering economic policy issue? What's the added value compared to the state we have now? Caren, would you like to go first?
Sure, and I also was remiss in thanking all of you, and it's really great to be part of this conversation. I really love your organizing model and your process and the inputs that you have solicited, and I really want to congratulate you on that. And I'm super happy to be with Vanessa, with whom we have been discussing really good partnership models, and also some of the others in this group. I think that, I've been doing this work for a very, very long time. I do think if we had had many years ago, and I hear what Vanessa has to say, some vision of a feminist foreign policy. And in some ways, I'm not opposed to having a feminist foreign policy, because I think the word feminist shows that there's different principles and different values that underlie foreign policy than the ones that we see conventionally. But if we had had that in place as the basic foreign policy stance, it would have been great. So what's the value add? Well, as a feminist economist for many years, many of us have been arguing, particularly in the macro realm, that we would prioritize social provisioning over a very narrow vision of economic growth. And I think that's really important. And I think a feminist foreign policy would help us get there faster. So what do I mean by social provisioning? It is providing the right regulatory macro fiscal policy framework for investments in social production, in reproduction, in people and their capabilities to be productive members of communities, the economy, and society. I think what that would have meant is that we could have actually got to think about how issues like care, which many people have referred to, the service of providing care, both from the public side as well as the private sector side, or even families. Care is a public good, and it produces human beings that are essential to the functioning of the economy. And if you have that lens, it means you make different choices in terms of where you might invest public resources. So you could clearly invest in caring sectors, whether it's education, health, social protection. But I think right now with COVID, in very few countries outside of the OECD, the idea that care services is part of our economic infrastructure has not yet taken hold. And I think feminist foreign policy would help us see care as part of economic infrastructure that deserves investment, that deserves continuity. And I think it's not an issue that's a women's issue. It's an issue for how we value and raise the next generation, boys and girls. And it is an issue for men and women in terms of their ability to participate in paid employment. So I think also flipping some of the ways we think about consumption versus investment is really important, and that would happen in fiscal policy. I also think we would maybe have more attention to issues in the sphere of paid employment around decent work and ways that we could get companies and countries to take high roads instead of low roads in terms of harmful competition that leads to a race to the bottom and essentially really gets extracts the absolute maximum out of workers, as opposed to really creating high roads where of investment in people where they can actually earn decent wages, they have the right type of social protection and access to benefits from the state. So I think that we may have been able to do more, I think, on that front. And there's probably a long list of very detailed issues that would make it easier, but let me stop there. The other thing I guess I would say with respect to the private sector is I think that the issues of social investment would be really important as an objective and for the bottom line, and how social investment can further a company's own bottom line, but also be good for the economy.
All right, let's continue. Vanessa, I would then ask you, regarding the private sector, Caren mentioned it as well. How could a feminist foreign policy engage and guide larger shares of the private sector to really be gender transformative and to contribute to true gender equality? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And actually, I wanted to just touch on the previous question as well to say, I think that we have such an incredible opportunity to, in international trade, for example, what would be made easier? We always have there's no data. We have insufficient data. The trading system is built on principles of non-discrimination, and I think a feminist foreign policy would help us to break through that and build an anti-discrimination multilateral trading system. And I think the moment is here, but maybe I'll have an opportunity to talk a bit more about that later on in this session. So in terms of the private sector, the private sector is not a standalone, distinct thing in its own silo. The private sector is embedded in a system where there are many market failures that relate to that are caused by gender norms, market failures that are caused by lack of access to resources by certain people, market failures that create information asymmetries, and so on. So I think a feminist foreign policy is really crucial to providing a framework through which different types of partnerships can be mobilized and different types of stakeholders can work together. Today, it's not just goods and services borders, it's also companies, and it's also people that span multiple countries, and that's why I think foreign policy can play such an effective role. So three concrete areas that I think governments can probably do more with is leveraging ODA as a tool to catalyze private sector resources. And we've talked a lot about the need to mobilize private sector resources to achieve the sustainable development goals. And here as well, when we talk about gender inequality, we need, I think, ODA can really catalyze private sector resources and push the private sector to go beyond compliance and into more transformative initiatives. For example, taking ODA and investing that in catalytic capital, in lending initiatives that are promoted by private financial institutions. And this is one of the areas that ITC has been working on with civil society, as well as with the financial services sector, to really fundraise catalytic capital from philanthropy and governments that can then crowd in private sector investors to invest in SMEs in countries that they would never typically invest in. Secondly, this area of, if you think about trade promotion as an area, typically women-led businesses don't get to participate as much in trade missions and trade activities. And so this is an area where policy can mandate and equip public institutions to ensure that women's participation in foreign trade missions and foreign trade activities is increased. And third, to provide platforms for public-private dialogue and cooperation to generate solutions to issues that are transnational in nature. For example, issues relating to regional or international value chains, where an incredible amount of cooperation is required across the value chain. So these are 3 areas, and I'm gonna mute my microphone so that I can shout at my housemate to keep the volume down behind me. We're working from home and it's evening. So these are some of the issues, I think, where the private sector, where feminist foreign policy needs to work. And it's, it's not just that, whilst the private sector is certainly realizing and the need to have a more responsible approach to the way that they do business, not just as a CSR issue, but as a sustainability and resilience issue. They need to build resilience into their value chains, going above and beyond and trying things and piloting things. This is an area that requires also policy coordination across borders and intergovernmental cooperation to really facilitate these budding initiatives taking flight and growing to scale.
Thank you. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think if we think of the Agenda 2030 and the SDGs, the private sector has to play a role. It is invited. It's an obligation. We have to include the private sector, not only because we have an SDG financing gap, but also because they're really, really at the leverage of so much. So thank you so much, Caren and Vanessa. I would say we would now have to discuss how do we make these recommendations we suggest in our report? How do we make them fly? Like, where do we go from now? Any suggestion? What does it take?
Maybe I can just start with a few things. I just want to say that I think I would prioritize a few of your recommendations right now for the economic recovery. And I think a number of that it applies to both public and private right now. So I think that there's some key areas that are just fundamental. The first is expanding and cementing social protection services. So I don't think it's just a matter of pensions. I think it's the whole realm of social protection. And I think that means cash transfers for vulnerable households. I think there's an area here of finance that we haven't really thought about for those firms that are a little bit more micro self-employed versus small and medium that really fall out of any kind of government net. They need access to services and to cash. So a financial agenda of reaching them. And I think, of course, the financial services sector. But I think to do that, we really need, governments in the private sector need to work in digitalizing. They need to work in digitalizing public services, whether it's receiving cash transfer, whether it's access to medical services, whether it's distance learning and education systems for kids. Digitalization, if done well and done right, can actually be a really important win-win. Now, the issue is that there are gender digital divides, there's inequalities in digitalization. So we have to put that those who are most excluded as the forefront of those who get these services. They get the training, they get the confidence building. So it's not just a matter of setting up a government saying you need to include this household in a social registry and they can be eligible for the cash benefit, but it's ensuring that, and this is where the private sector comes in, that the technology, whether it's the phone or whether it's the computer or whether it's other types of technology for access, get to those who need it, you know, and that means girls and boys as well as women and men. So that is absolutely critical. And I think for the next 20 years, it's going to be critical for the growth sectors of the economy as well. So these are things we need to absolutely put in place. And the benefits here are going to be for jobs, are going to be for entrepreneurs, are going to be for saving, you know, for the financial sector and so forth. I think we need a stronger regulatory agenda. I think if we think about social protection as well, we can help, we need to extend those services to informally employed. So we do need some kind of regulatory environment of a social floor for those who just need to have the resources to cope. I think also then in the financial system, I mentioned this missing middle. We need to find new forms of finance to reach those who are, when I think about India, for instance, and the entrepreneurs who are part of organizations like SEVA, and they may not be reached by India's banks, and they may not be part of the social protection service. We need to have financial products and services that reach that group. And I really think as well, I'm very much supportive of the kinds of trade in the trade system going forward. So our institutions are governments who lead. It has to be the international financial institutions and others who provide support. It has to be other partners, civil society, the private sector that are part of making all of these things happen. And I think the COVID pandemic provides an opening for this, but it means we all have to be part of it, and we can't leave it to others.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Vanessa, is there one or two recommendations you would absolutely favor, and any ideas how we could push them?
I will stick to one. I like all of them, but I'll just stick to the one, and that's digitalization.
Yeah.
If there's anything that this pandemic has taught us is that we urgently need to support all members of society have access to the internet, access to skills, access to technologies. You know, they've become even more central to our lives. And, you know, Caren has already said a lot, but, you know, I want to highlight also in trade, technological innovation is such a cornerstone of competitiveness. And it's not just, you know, tech entrepreneurs anymore. It's every person involved in economic activity needs to undergo some form of digital transformation. And we've seen actually that it's helped level the playing field a bit during this time. One area that we're very positive about is trade missions. So typically it costs a lot of money to go to exhibit, visas, and as I said, you often see women not able to get to that final hurdle, maybe get permission from their families to travel alone. And we've seen a lot of women being able to participate in these virtual trade fairs. In terms of and then, of course, trade policy was another recommendation, as well as access to finance. But given the time, I want to focus on, I think, maybe what I think needs to happen in order to move this agenda forward. First of all, as I think I said before, we actually already know a lot. We actually already have a lot of data. And I think where we need to really focus is on creating the types of tools, concrete tools that can really help us to close these gaps. And there are a growing number of good tools that will help us close the gap. Secondly, again, around solutions, we've seen in our work that there's so many amazing solutions on the ground that no one hears about. And I think as a next step, I'd love to challenge you guys to think about how you can bring more of these solutions from the ground, share them and get them replicated and scaled up, because there are a number of solutions. And if you look at our SheTrades.com, we've actually started collecting a lot of solutions from different countries on how they're solving some of these challenges. And then I guess third, I would say I had a third idea of how to, the third was to make sure that this stays firmly on the agenda and not to let it slip away, especially now that governments are investing so much on building back better and changing, going to the new normal. So, you know, make sure that this stays at the top of the agenda.
I actually think that budgeting with a gender lens is really important, but I think the practice of gender budgeting needs to really be strengthened. And I think all of the academic work on gender budgeting has really shown that there's somewhat of a mixed set of results. And I think the way to strengthen gender-based budgeting is to do two things, is to really make sure that it's linked to government's own policy commitments.
Yeah.
Because if you don't have the link to the policy commitments, you end up in a process that doesn't really lead to anything. And it's just kind of at the level of training. And the second thing is, I think, adding an element of performance. So performance-based budgeting in terms of giving incentives, whether it's a municipality or a state, to actually achieve results with some kind of incentive, incentive funding contingent on results being achieved. So it really forces then the municipality or the state or the federal government to make the investment in the right type of data collection and analysis to see that results are actually being achieved. And I have to say, there was an example of this in Nigeria about 10 years ago when Ngozi Oyola was the finance minister, and she had introduced an approach like that. Other governments have started to follow that lead. But I think going beyond just a gender responsive budget to really thinking about budgeting for results is really where we want that conversation to go.
What I would like policymakers to do is to go beyond the excuse of not insufficient data to act, right? Yeah. So they already have to have the will to act, and then fine, we can look for the data to help them design the policies.